Righto, thank you so much, Andrew. Really appreciate it, as well as appreciate the opportunity to speak briefly. And so here we are. Again, if you're wondering about the title, those of us in aviation are overly fond of a particular poem called High Flight, which I have included at the end, touching the face of God, referring to being at altitude. It's a unique experience, and it goes hand in hand with the other quote about, once you've slipped the surly bonds, once you've flown, you'll never be happy on the ground again. So usually for most of us, when we fly, we do it for the rest of our careers, do it for the rest of our lives. I was very fortunate in that my aviation career started as part of my military training, and that was 20 years ago, and I've still been doing it. Hopefully I can look forward to another 40 or 60 years of doing this. So a little bit about me, where I'm coming from. As I mentioned, I started out my medical training in the military, and things that I have done unique to aircrew, aside from military applications, which we'll discuss a little bit. I had the good fortune to also work PRN, or it's really volunteer because it's military support, to NASA for space shuttles and launches. Launches and landings, which includes a totally unique set of aerospace physiology, as well as I've done dive medicine, which also dive medicine, aerospace, all the same stuff, right? You're all talking about the body under pressure differentials, things like that. And then, of course, I've worked in the civilian world in a variety of practice environments as a flight nurse and paramedic. Not sure if we need to do a conflict of interest statement, but other than plugging WADM, World Association of Disaster and Emergency Medicine, our upcoming Congress in Brisbane, and then, of course, our emergency medical response section, I have no conflicts of interest. All my biases extend to the fact that I love what I do. Lots of alphabet soup behind my name. Basically just means that I am triple boarded in neonatal, pediatric, and adults in the ER, the ICU, as well as critical care transport and flight. I've given you my email address there. If you're on social media, you're also more than welcome to find me on Facebook. What we're looking for from you guys is questions. If you have questions, I'm giving you a brief overview, a little bit of the history, very brief, and mostly focusing directly on day-to-day operations, what it takes to get into flight medicine, what we have to do to maintain proficiency, some of the different roles and responsibilities, issues of aircrew coordination, things like that. You are currently in listen-only mode, but you will be able to send questions years. Sometimes that's kind of where I go now, is folks kind of know me for specializing in neonates, peds, special needs children, and then also mechanical ventilation, both fixed wing, rotor wing operation, etc. Shameless plug alert, as I already mentioned, but I'll take just a moment to hover over for a second, is I'm the chairperson of the Emergency Medical Response Section Special Interest Group for WADM. So you've got a slide there telling you what we're all about. And of course, flight medicine falls directly underneath this. We're about to start sending out solicitations for officers, things like that. So keep an eye peeled on your email. Please do not hesitate to email either myself or Andrew with your interest in joining the section or your interest of being in service to the section. Okay, we can't reach out to you if you don't reach out to us. So that's who we are. That's what we're all about. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd love to have you. As far as flight medicine has been going on for almost exactly 100 years. In fact, just a wee scotch over 101 years, almost to this very day. Got its start with a lovely lady, Marie Marvingt, known as, the founder of aviation medicine. She started out as a pilot and had all sorts of wonderful adventures. They called her the fiancée of danger. Back then, things were a little more sensationalistic. When was back then? As early as 1911, 1912, Marie had the idea for air ambulance operations. And you can see from the drawing here on the slide, this is one of her very first descriptions. Used a stretcher slung underneath the fuselage of a biplane. Okay? And obviously that concept has evolved a bit since then. Marie disguised herself as a man, enlisted in the infantry, got caught, wound up working as a medical volunteer with the Red Cross all during World War I. And the entire time that she did this, because she was a pilot first, she pushed this idea of Med-Evacs, medical evacuation. And why do you think that was? Well, rhetorical question. The same thing that held true 100 years ago holds true today. People succumb, perish, increased morbidity and mortality from lack of access to specialized care, in this case, the battlefield environment, and specifically trauma management. There's all sorts of different stages of evacuation when we talk about military, from simply exfiltration, getting out of the hot zone, to getting to a field hospital, to stabilization, emergency trauma surgery, further evacuation beyond that to follow on specialty care. So her emphasis obviously was getting folks out of the line of battle and back to that battlefield hospital. And again, she pursued this idea her whole life. And like a lot of medical interventions in the civilian world, especially in the world of trauma, civilian follows military. So it's a reoccurring theme, but the civilian world is not too far behind the military world in this. It didn't take too long for it to catch on. One of the first recorded medical evacuations in a military context, again, was almost 101 years ago, a little over 101 years ago to this very day. And one of the upcoming slides I show you, it's the 90th anniversary of Royal Flying Doctor Service. So you can see the civilian world didn't wait too long to jump on this bandwagon. Again, trauma is trauma, getting folks stopping the bleed, getting folks to definitive care in a timely manner is the key to reducing morbidity and mortality. Another sketch of Madame Marie showing her inspiration. Here she had already been busted for masquerading as an infantryman, and this is showing her at work in the Red Cross station. A little bit, these slides, this webinar will be available to you afterwards. I'm not sure if we'll put a link to the slides on the Wadham site. I know we'll put the webinar itself on there. So here I just give you a little bit more in-depth detail about Marie. And of course, if you want the slides, you're more than welcome to email me for it. Okay, but you can see she started on this actually in 1911, and 1955 she was still receiving awards for this. Okay, so we're talking over a 40-year career in nothing but aviation medicine. This woman single-handedly shaped what it is that we do today. So when we talk about Med-Evacs, people often think of rotor wing helicopters. As Igor Stravinsky said, an airplane can fly and drop flowers, but a helicopter can land and save your life. Well, there's a lot of limitations to what Mr. Sikorsky said, and a lot of shades there that aren't necessarily true. there's a lot that you can do in an airplane that you can't do in a helicopter. For example, helicopters are limited by range, limited by space, which in turn limits the interventions that we can perform en route, and also puts limits on what definitive care the patient can access. But again, good start. Rotor wing. Here showing you some of our early medical applications, and I've tried to give you a little bit from everyone here. You may be familiar with the airframe in the upper left corner, Korean War. So if any of you watch old television, you may have seen something similar in MASH. And then, of course, I fly predominantly fixed wing, so I have a bias towards fixed wing. Here showing you one of the early Med-Evac aircraft in a military context, of course, from one of our allies. I say our allies, of course, because I'm from the United States. Hopefully we've got some folks out of the country listening in. And interestingly enough, speaking of civilian following military, this particular airframe, I won't bore you with the details, but this particular airframe was actually the first airframe that was approved for widespread civilian use. Both the military and especially the civilian world, aircraft used for Med-Evac adhere to an entirely different set of standards and have to be vetted for those standards, as well as every piece of equipment that goes in them. So it's not, it's not the same working in a hospital as it is working at altitude. Again, there's pressure differentials. We don't always pressurize the cabins of our fixed wing aircraft to sea level or ground level, I should say more accurately. So there's all kinds of considerations. They have to be rated for impact, rated for takeoff, rated for landing, many considerations. So again, this particular fixed wing aircraft was one of the first military ones that was adapted and adopted for widespread use in the civilian world. Again, just a few more slides here showing you. This was actually a helicopter that was adapted from military use to civilian use. And of course, I think most of you are familiar with modern military Med-Evac. So that airframe is probably pretty familiar to most of you listening in on this. Here, just a slide illustrating what I said verbally. 19 February 2017 was the 100th anniversary, and it all depends on how you count, but this is Royal Air Force. So they count 19 February 2017 as the 100th anniversary of a Med-Evac. 19 February 1917, Lance Corporal McGregor, and he actually, there wasn't a medical attendant on that flight. They basically stuffed him in the back seat of a biplane. Okay? And the other point that I was trying to make here is, of course, Royal Flying Doctor Service, comparing and contrasting, a military agency and a civilian agency from the same Commonwealth, 90 years. So about 10 years behind. Civilian lags military about 10 years behind in this regard. Some of the roles, we'll go over it more specifically, but we've evolved a lot from Med-Evacs, exfiltrations, and then Med-Evacs to many specialized applications in the civilian world. It's very common to those of us who do it. This isn't my role. I've never performed in this capacity outside of the military, but remote rescue. And for remote rescue, they haven't really adapted a lot of short takeoff and landing fixed wing aircraft. So helicopters, of course, are still the airframe of choice for remote rescue operations. Here I'm showing you a German airframe, but the limitations of rotor wing, again, are cabin space, which limits the interventions that we can perform, as well as they don't really have a lot of legs as far as distance and fuel capacity. So that brings us to the opposite end of the spectrum, using jets for TransContinental. So just a few quick images there showing you the wide range of applications in the civilian world. Talked a little bit about the military, talked a little bit about civland, and we'll zoom in on some of that in a moment. So why would we fly patients? Why don't we just take them by ground? Well, usually it's a question of distance as well as terrain. And main reasons to fly fall into two broad categories: resource-limited areas, and then access to specialty care. As I mentioned, exfiltrating, getting someone out, a trauma patient out, would be an example of that. Resource-limited areas, talking about things like Australia, for example, wide open swaths of rural area is a prime example of that. When we talk about teams that fly in mission profiles, we have specialty teams. So access to specialty care, it can mean transferring a patient somewhere where they can get more specialized care for a specific medical condition. It can also mean referring to the mission profile. Here, common examples of specialty teams in the civilian world include neonatal and pediatric, and usually all of these draw from practitioners who have specialized in that skill set. We do a lot of cross training, but numerous studies have shown that better outcomes are consistently achieved, for example, with neonatal and pediatric ICU practitioners versus adult ICU practitioners who have been cross-trained. So that is the reason behind our specialty teams. And even that cross-training, if you get an adult practitioner who cross-trains, they're required to have very rigorous courses of education. We'll touch on that a little bit briefly later. So neonatal, pediatric, search and rescue. As I mentioned, I haven't done that since the military. That's not my wheelhouse. High-risk obstetrics, medically fragile patients, such as those that require ECMO. These are just a few examples of some of the specially evolved roles that we would use a Med-Evac for versus ground pounding or ground transport. Resource-limited areas. So we've already talked about moving patients from the battlefield to behind the lines, military forward operations. Some other military applications would be combat search and rescue, or because I was in the Navy, one that we do a lot of in the Navy is guard operations. And by that, I don't necessarily mean Coast Guard, but similar to Coast Guard, in that when you're operating aircraft off of ships, right, we have to be trained to recover those service members should they have a mishap in a water emergency. Some examples in the civilian world would include rural remote areas, as I mentioned, rural flying doctor service, or for myself, I used to fly a lot in the Southwest, lots and lots of wide open space, tons of desert, helping patients access specialty care. So special needs children, for example, patients cystic fibrosis, congenital diaphragmatic hernia, cerebral palsy children requiring multiple specialized follow-on surgeries. Children's Flight of Hope's a charity that I work with and that one of the companies I fly with supports and we serve. So there's a lot of support organizations out there for special needs patients. Okay. Individual roles. So we talk about the team roles. Individual roles, often determined by the team or mission profile. In other words, you can have a specialty team, but then also we will, if we have a generalist team, we'll pick people relative to their specific skill set. Like, for example, if the company that I contract with was doing a special needs child, they might ask me versus someone who did adults to take that transport. Some examples here, I've used some abbreviations, I apologize for that, but just giving you some specific examples. So pilots, single pilot IFR, twin pilot IFR, sometimes we fly with one pilot, sometimes we fly with two. IFR, instrument flight rules or instrument meteorological conditions. You might hear IMC. So some programs only operate in the day under VMC, visual meteorologic conditions. So pilot profile will often be chosen based on a pilot's experience, also relative to hours in a particular airframe like fixed wing, rotor wing, so FWRW. Paramedics are kind of the generalist of the flight medicine world, at least in the United States. They kind of have to be the jack of all trades. Nurses, we usually choose our nurses specific to their patient environment. Respiratory therapists are often brought along because, of course, they are the specialist in ventilatory management. Not that our paramedics, nurses, physicians, nurse practitioners can't do vent management, but often many people choose their team composition to have a respiratory therapist specifically for that. And that's especially the case when we're talking about medically fragile children and neonates. That's a very specialized area in the world of pulmonology. So that would be a great example of when we would want a specially trained respiratory therapist on board rather than having a nurse or a paramedic who's a generalist. Physicians have a tendency to have a background in emergency medicine, but often depending on what the mission profile is, for example, the physician could be a cardiothoracic surgeon or a trauma surgeon, depending on exactly what the patient needed. Nurse practitioners are often brought along, usually for specific specialty patient populations. Neonatal nurse practitioners being a very good example of that. As I mentioned, individual roles are often determined by team or mission profile, unless it's remote, and then we have to be generalist. This often comes down to staffing issues, manning issues. When you're in very rural areas, you simply don't have access to specialists because you don't have a broad enough patient population to support that specialty. A very basic example of that in the United States, for example, that's kind of the difference between our level 1 and level 2 trauma center designations, is access to neurosurgery. That then translates into the aeromedical world in that, out in the Midwest, we don't have enough of a patient population to warrant having a neonatal nurse practitioner on a team, so everyone on the team has to do neonates. Everyone on the team has to be prepared to do high-risk OB. Royal Flying Doctor Service, again, is the quintessential example of this, and they, unless I'm greatly mistaken or things have changed, they actually require their nurses to hold midwifery certifications over and above their nursing licenses and degrees. So a couple of specific examples there where the individual role, we have to be generalist versus specialist. In the United States, there's multiple organizations around the world. There's even multiple organizations in the United States. I mentioned CAMES as a prime example. They're one of many, but they're pretty much considered to be, one of the go-to organizations in the U.S. And often reimbursement for medical flights is tied to CAMES accreditation. So what does CAMES accreditation mean, and how does that relate to our previous slides? CAMES gives the recommendations and requirements for these specialty teams, as well as for practitioners who see specialty patients. For example, CAMES recommends multiple neonatal pediatric specific qualifications, certifications, if you're going to transport those patients. So there's a whole process that you have to go through to be accredited by CAMES, as well as to maintain accreditation. And those criteria are generally related to optimizing patient outcome by assuring that we've got the right mix of skills for the right patient. What does it take to fly? This is probably, man has always had a fascination with flight, from Leonardo da Vinci all the way to the present day. This is probably one of the most common questions that aircrew get, well, how do I get to be one of you guys? So a few slides here on what it takes. For example, in the military, I had a minimum of 500 hours of aircrew training. That was just the initial training, 500 hours. That doesn't count all of the specialty things that go on after that. And we don't just train in military. this holds true for the civilian world too. We don't just train in medical matters. We have to be familiar, with aircraft operations, meteorology, engine theory, things like this, because when you're up in the air, it's all one team, one fight. So even though we're medical, we're not self-loading freight. We have to keep eyes out for the pilot, be aware. We do our own walk-arounds looking for things like improperly fastened hatches, making sure our gear's stowed correctly, FOD, foreign object debris walk down, all kinds of a million and one little things. Medical personnel are not just medical when it comes to aviation, and aviation personnel are not just aviation when it comes to Med-Evac. Other basic requirements: several years experience in critical care and emergency medicine. The minimum is generally considered to be 3 years. Many companies will not even look at you if you don't have 5. And then, as I mentioned earlier, specialty practice is often a requirement that you have to have not just X number of years in critical care, but for example, X number of years in neonatal intensive care, high risk obstetrics, search and rescue, high angle rescue. They're looking for folks that have done that. Okay? In addition to that experience, there are many, many certifications that you have to have both in medical patients and trauma patients in order to even get an interview. And then you have to get past the interview. Board certification, either specialty board certification, or if you're a generalist, then you have to be certified in flight either as a paramedic or a nurse. And then if you want to do specialty patient populations, you're required to have your specialty populations. Again, who requires this? CAMES is one example, and then individual companies often set even more stringent requirements based off the CAMES requirements. If you fly rotor wing, again, the limitation on that airframe is usually fuel loadout and legs. It can only go so far. So often there's a weight limitation as well on rotor wing. Other things, intangibles. So those are absolute must. I can tell you that you can have all of that and you'll get nowhere. We have a saying in aviation that attitude equals altitude, and there's a few reasons for that. You don't have a support network when you're out there. You can usually get a hold of medical direction by sat phone, depending on where you're at, what you're doing, but it's you and the patient, just like it's the pilot and the aircraft. So we're not looking for technicians, we're looking for clinicians. We have a saying in aviation that you need to stay ahead of the aircraft. It's the same thing when we talk about aeromedical transport. You have to stay ahead of the patient. So we're looking for people who are proactive, not reactive. Clinicians, not technicians. It's great if you can follow the protocols. That's a bare minimum. Okay, knowing your protocols inside and out is only the start. The other thing is, because we're all dependent on each other up there, team player. There are no rooms for personality conflict at altitude or with critically ill or medically fragile patients. So 2 things that we look for in addition to just baseline proficiency, also how well you interact with others, both the aviation side of the house and the medical side of the house. Reasons for that: the medical crew, as I said, constantly eyes out for the pilot. Likewise, the pilot helps coordinate patient care. So some examples of that would be things like our flight profile or how we pressurize the cabin could depend on what kind of mechanisms of injury the patient has. A very common basic example on that everyone gets beaten into their head very early is if the patient has any trapped air in their body, like say, for example, a tension pneumothorax or pneumocephalus, anything like that. Well, Boyle's law, we go up in altitude, volume and pressure inversely proportional, that air is going to expand with deleterious effects. So we have to work closely with the pilot to coordinate our flight profile in the patient's best interest. Okay. Often, another thing, not always, very rarely an option with rotor wing, is that we often, I shouldn't have used the word packs, but passengers. So often we take family members along, and there's multiple reasons for doing that. It could be something as simple as we're going from a remote environment, to a metropolitan area, and the patient needs a loved one there to care for them. And just like it would take many hours or many days to transport that patient by ground, it would take many hours or days for their family members to arrive at their bedside. So often we'll take a family member to serve as an advocate for the patient and a support mechanism. The pilot plays a big role in that. Often with complex chronically ill patients, the family member is your very best resource. That is especially the case with special needs kids. I cannot emphasize that enough. That's another reason why there's absolutely no room for arrogance in aerospace medicine. You have constantly got to be eyes out, ears out, and ready to collaborate on the patient's behalf, and that includes listening to the family members, especially medically fragile, complex chronic children. Other things, if you don't fly, you may not realize, especially if you don't fly Med-Evacs, but we're all one crew, aircrew coordination. So the pilot briefs us on all the aviation conditions, just like we brief him on the passenger conditions. And we have a saying, often we run with a crew of 3 if we're flying single pilot. So we say 3 to go, 1 to say no. All it takes is one person to wave off. That's it. If we don't like the weather, we see weather rolling in, etc. So all of these things very tightly coordinated between the medical crew and the aviation crew. Line is very blurred. So that's why we say aeromedical. So we don't just hire you for proficiency. We also hire you for attitude, how well you can interact with others, the aviation side of the house, patient family members, also the sending facility. Again, very common mission profile, IFT, interfacility transfer. We're transferring a patient from a rural hospital to a trauma center. It takes good people skills to interact with the sending facility and ensure a smooth transition and optimize continuum of care for the patient. So cannot stress enough, it is not just knowledge skill set, it's also people skills. Once you get the job, what goes on after that? Follow on training. Aircrew coordination, I just gave you several examples of that. There's many times when we hire someone, right, we're hiring them from the ICU or the ER, and they don't know much about flying other than what they've studied for their certification exams. So the pilots are educating the air crew, the medical crew. Often we do a lot of work together in that regard with respect to training, especially when we start talking about airframe specific. The pilots have gone through a lot of training and a lot of examination to be experts in the specific airframe. They're the ones who educate the medical air crew, especially with regards to what we call EPs or emergency procedures, because again, we're all in it together. Once we actually get out of the hangar, once the crew knows how to talk to each other and once the crew knows how to coordinate into an emergency, then we have to look at preparing for contingencies. As I mentioned, operating in remote areas, wilderness survival becomes an issue. We in the Midwest, we often do specialized training in desert survival. In areas, mountainous regions, winter regions, there's specialized training in winter survival. Operating over water, we have what we call dunkers. There's helo dunkers, for example. So we have specialized water egress training as well as water survival. Once you safely exit the aircraft, how do you stay alive? And then, as I mentioned, in some of our wilderness survival rescue mission profiles, you're going to require a lot of specialized training in hoist operations, things like that. So many, many examples of mission-specific follow-on training. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, if you're a generalist, usually it's arranged for you to get specialty follow-on training. Say, for example, you're an adult practitioner. Well, and we don't have a neonatal pediatric team, well, then ideally you're going to do clinical rotations through neonatal intensive care units and pediatric intensive care units. Or say, for example, you're a nurse, so you don't have a lot of experience in airway management, because outside of flight nursing, nurses generally don't intubate patients. So those folks lacking in intubation experience usually do very intense operating room rotations where they practice getting intubations. Me, for example, it was very self-imposed. When I got out of the military, that was not something that I had had a lot of experience in. It wasn't part of our doctrine at the level that I worked at. That's just not what we were doing in emergent care at that time. So I personally put in over 1,000 hours in the OR, making friends with anesthesiology and doing every difficult airway that I could beg permission to be supervised doing. That's the only way you can learn it, right? So lots of follow-on training specific to your mission profile. Here's just some examples of some water survival training that I went through in the military. D-West, right? Because we're talking about parachuting. Again, I was aircrew in the military, so how to handle a parachute at sea. This is Pensacola Bay, cradle of naval aviation. Here's a dunker trainer. This is specifically a cockpit dunker. I couldn't find any nice pictures of our helo dunker. They're online, but I was looking for one specific to when I went through. But yeah, we actually basically put you in a large metal drum and sink it at the bottom of the pool, and you're blindfolded and you have to egress. And we do that in the civilian world as well with our crews that do overwater operations. What else do you have to do in terms of follow-on training? Of course, you have to maintain your certifications and skill sets. Many of those skill sets are what we call low volume, high technical. So maintaining proficiencies, such as practicing intubation every day, periodic ICU OR rotations, and then refresher training for things like survival medicine. Common misconceptions about flight medicine. My two pet peeves, and not just mine, but shared by many in the industry, how folks perceive us. We're not heroes, we're not angels, we're not Top Gun. Again, arrogance has no place in aviation medicine, none. None. And we do not race against time, death, the Grim Reaper, none of that either, okay? Those are two very common misconceptions about aviation medicine. As I said, there's utterly no place for arrogance or hero worship. It takes years and years of very focused, very dedicated training and mentorship to get to where you're at and to stay where you're at. And we all work together as a team, okay? So don't call us heroes. We all work together as a team. Don't think you're going to be a hero if you fly. You're constantly learning. You're constantly evolving, right? We never plateau. Examples of that constant learning and process improvement. In the US, we have a thing called Concern Network, where whenever we have an aviation mishap or a near miss, it's voluntary self-reporting, but the agency in question will report that to the Concern Network, and that way everyone can access and learn from their mistake in terms of managing the airframe or managing the patient. Concern is more specific to airframe issues and near misses, things like that. In addition to that, ideally you're doing debriefs after every patient contact, and we have quality assurance programs doing chart reviews, things like that, in addition to ongoing education and training. We do not race against time, death, the Grim Reaper. Failing to plan is planning to fail. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. We want to stay ahead of the aircraft and ahead of the patient. Everything we do ideally is very deliberate, very thought out. There's no trauma drama, especially when it is a very hectic situation. Say you're doing a scene call, that's exactly when you need to go into time compression and slow things down, okay? There is no race, okay? Yes, we need to get the patient to definitive care in a timely fashion, but it's done in a very measured and well thought out way. Sobering thoughts, basic parts of, should be part of every aircrew member's life. I mean, you can die walking down the street, but you can also die falling out of the sky. So generally speaking, aircrew are briefed on advanced directives, things like that. Conscientious managers will make sure that their staff have those things in order. The thing that you're seeing on the right there, you can't do this job for long without knowing someone who has died. So those are our aircrew memorial wings. Additional thoughts as we close. Stressors of flight. Just flying in and of itself is very demanding just because of the changes in altitude, risk for dehydration, things like that. So very important that you plan ahead. You know, alcohol use, tobacco use. FAA has rules about, you know, bottle to brief time, things like that. So we try and be aware of the stressors of flight. If you're ever around anyone that flies very long, you notice that we drink lots of water when we're on duty because we lose lots of water. Self-care, cannot emphasize that enough. Most people that fly are physically healthy. You know, we work out a lot. Work-life balance. Our patient contact involves, you know, people having the worst day of their life. That can take a psychological toll on you. Very important that you develop skills to compartmentalize so that you're not ignoring your family, you're not ignoring yourself. And last but not least in that, of course, we all have patients that we remember. We all have situations that we remember. Very important that you proactively address mental health issues. We could say that about anyone that works in disaster and emergency medicine. So also true in aviation medicine. Future directions of aviation medicine. As equipment gets more refined, that opens up more mission profiles to us. Things like, for example, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. I give you a couple of pictures here, Nova Lung and McKay Cardio Health. Proving Igor Stravinsky wrong. This is one of the hot new airframes, vertical takeoff and landing from Augusta Westland. So this does expand the mission profiles of fixed wing aircraft. It's not really truly a fixed wing aircraft, not truly rotor wing. So now we've got rotor wing with legs and space to actually work on the patient. Other future directions include pilotless aircraft, right? Drones, either the patient's packaged and put into the drone. The Marines are working on this. The United States Marine Corps is working on this right now. I would like to see perhaps pilotless aircraft with a caregiver inside. And then a personal favorite of mine, humanitarian and charity. They especially have the same issues that we have as far as remote access, especially trauma. And this holds true in many, many developing nations. Here I just give you a quick example of Haiti Air Ambulance because I spend a lot of the time out of the country in Haiti. And for our trauma patients in Haiti, there is absolutely no question that Med-Evac has made a positive impact on their outcomes. Here, if you're not familiar with high flight and touching the face of God, the title of the presentation, I've included it there for you. So hopefully the aviation bug will bite you like it's got the rest of us. If there's any questions, comments, or concerns, hopefully you've been sending those in to Andrew. We'll answer those. Or you can go live if we can key the mics. Again, 2 more shameless plugs. Please mark our World Congress for the 7th and 10th of May 2019 in Brisbane, Australia. It's going to be quite a lot of fun. Throw a few shrimp on the Barbie. And please consider joining the Emergency Medical Response Special Interest Group. So appreciate you having me. Thank you very much. Don't hesitate to reach out to me via social media or email, and standing by for questions.
Thank you, Sean. That was very informative and very comprehensive. Just to be clear, for all the participants in the remote audience, we will be posting a video of this on the website, most likely later today, if not tomorrow. And I will send an email out letting everyone know when that's available. And we'll also have the slides posted as well. So both of those will be accessible within the next 24 hours. So,
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew.
and at this stage is when we open it up to questions. And if anyone has a question, they can use the raised hand icon. And if you click on that, it'll indicate to me you have a question, and I can unmute your microphone. And then you can ask a question directly to Sean. Or if you prefer, you can send one to me via the chat message. So we can do that either way. If there's anyone out there willing to break the ice and ask the first question, that usually helps stimulate the discussion here. But I'm not seeing any at the moment.
Well, and that's always one of the interesting things about a session like this. It's a lot easier to engage an audience when they're in front of you. So it's okay if no one wants to send a text message, or if no one wants to go live with a question. Again, we have, at least I have no idea of who the 30 people are that are listening or what your backgrounds are. When I lecture in person, I often joke that if it was up to me, I wouldn't even use PowerPoints. I would just have a dry erase board and be like, what do you guys want to know? Right? We always joke that if you need a PowerPoint, you probably don't know your stuff inside and out. So, you know, it's a lot easier to draw folks out in person. Again, for all I know, I've got 30 total experts on Med-Evacs listening in, and the presentation might have been a little broad or basic for you. So not quite sure what our audience composition is. If you don't feel comfortable texting in or being unmuted, again, just reach out to me via email or social media. The picture you saw in the upper left-hand corner of my intro slide, that's my profile on Facebook, and I've given you my email address multiple places in the slides.
Well, we do have a couple hands raised here, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute Dimitri Piros's microphone and let Dimitri ask a question. You there, Dimitri?
Hi, Sean. Thank you very much. Just for the audience, the name is Dimitri Piros. I'm a medical doctor, and I've been flying aeromedical evacuations in basically from the Greek islands back to mainland Greece since 1994. I've read articles about how dangerous medical evacuations are in the US and how increased the accident rate from Med-Evacs is comparing to other flights. Care to comment about that?
Sure. So it's multifactorial, and a lot of the causal factors, you know, when we look at root mean cause analysis, those have evolved quite a bit over the past few years. And that's one of the things that a lot of our regulatory agencies get involved with. You know, there's always folks who'll point fingers, like, for example, often in Europe, folks fly twin pilot. You know, in the military, I'm used to flying twin pilot, twin engine. So everyone has preferences as far as number of pilots, number of engines. Everyone claims that those are causal factors. One thing that I can say without hesitation, something I'm very passionate about, is the surviving the impact. There are a lot of things we could do in the United States to enhance crash resistance. That's particularly true in rotor wing that are, you know, if they happen to crash while their tanks are full. There's some we just had an incredible lawsuit where we actually lost one of our oldest surviving Med-Evac pilots in the United States. He's kind of been with it from the beginning. And there was a huge settlement involved in that because they were flying an aircraft that had not been updated to the latest and greatest post-crash standards. And unfortunately, it's not a requirement in the industry. So that case is drawing a lot of attention to some of the survivability factors. Other things that we're having increased recognition of and incorporating more training of in the United States is that aircrew resource management that I spoke of before. A lot of our early incidences could be directly traced to failures in communication amongst crew, or compartmentalizing of roles to the detriment of the team as a whole. So I'm not familiar with how you do things in your operation in Greece, so it's difficult for me to compare and contrast. I'm hoping, perhaps you and I can talk one-on-one, or maybe I'll even be lucky enough to see you in Brisbane in 2019, because, again, we all learn and grow from each other. So I'm excited to hear about how you've been doing things over in the islands.
We've got a few more questions here. I see a hand raised from Robert Mitchell. Robert, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone here. You can go ahead and ask Sean your question. You there, Robert?
Are you able to hear me?
Indeed.
Yep, loud and clear.
Excellent. So what a great presentation. Thank you so much, Sean. I love the history piece. I love the whole heritage piece that you brought in. It really puts everything in perspective. I'm an instructor connected with Beth Israel in Boston and in disaster medicine, and we're trying to explore drone use in disaster medicine. I really can't seem to find anywhere in the U.S. where drones are used on a regular basis in disaster response, except wildfires. So they are used fairly extensively in wildfires in California and Washington State. But for just a routine motor vehicle accident, with a pileup, those kinds of things, we all know that drones will enable us, that bird's eye view, enable us to resource manage better. Do you know of any place in the U.S.?
I don't, and actually, I kind of bemoan that fact as well. We're at the very bottom of the power curve on that, Robert. We're talking about using more in the military and battlefield surveillance. So I suspect that again, the civilian world lags the military world slightly and things like that. If I was in your shoes, I would be looking to liaise with military folks, because as far as the civilian world, you're probably at the top of our game. You're probably one of the go-to guys. And if you're looking for someone that knows more than you, it is rapidly evolving in the military, both not just for battlefield surveillance, but also specifically for medical applications and disaster humanitarian relief applications as well, and staging resources exactly as you referred to. And if you contact me offline, we can put our heads together, maybe come up with some names. But I don't have any points of contact in the civilian world. In fact, I'm delighted that you rang in, because you now just became one of my contacts in the civilian world. So thank you so much for your question, and I hope you will reach out to me, because we could both learn a lot from each other.
Okay, we have another question from Ola Denenbell. Ola, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone.
Thanks, Andrew. Can
You there?
you hear me?
Yep.
Yes,
clear.
hello.
Yes, we have you.
You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Wonderful.
excellent. Thank you, Sean, for that overview. That was wonderful, and certainly gave a good general picture. I've flown international air ambulance for quite a number of years, and I'm just wondering if you are aware of any educational opportunities for people who are interested in becoming involved. Because typically, for example, in the company that I work for, they have their own training program, and I realize that certain features change from airframe to airframe depending on what you're flying and the size of the crew and that sort of thing. But there are certain principles that are in common with all of it, and you brought some of those up. The soft skills, teamwork, that sort of thing. But are you aware then of any programs that exist either within academic institutions or otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, we, like most professional associations and groups, We offer seminars and things like that at our professional association meetings. There's always workshops. There are a few private companies that do offer, and they're becoming more and more literally every day, every year, that offer private aircrew coordination training, and specifically things like water egress training, things like that. And then we also, and gosh, I'm blanking out on it, but we actually have a university that has a graduate level program specifically for Med-Evac. Also, Australia has one. So there's one in the US and there's one in Australia. And I just don't have their names or contact information at the tip of my frontal lobe. But there are two very prominent programs in academia. We have regular offerings at our annual professional association meetings. And then there's a number of private contractors that also offer that sort of training. But you're right, it's not very widespread. You kind of have to seek it out to know about it, because the client base is so small. You're not going to see it really widely advertised outside of the industry. But again, I would love to learn more of your perspective, and if you contact me offline, that'll give me a little while to look up a few of the programs that I referenced in general for you, and I can give you more specific information. So I'd love to talk to you more, Ola. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, we got a few more questions here. They've been sent to me by chat. So I'm going to go ahead and read a few of them. We're going to be wrapping things up here shortly because we're at the 60-minute mark here. So I'm going to go ahead and read a question from Marie, and it says, as an EMT, what pathway would you suggest for me to start on getting involved in flight medicine?
Sure, and that is one of the most common questions. And Marie, I don't know if you're on social media or not, but EMS Flight Web, EMS Flight Crew. There's a few groups on Facebook. Those are discussed very regularly, and they're multifactorial and tons of perspective from different areas. Generally, we want our medics to have high call volume with high acuity. Also, it may sound counterintuitive, opposite ends of the spectrum. Not only do we want you to have high call volume with high acuity, but sometimes rural experience is good because you have to do more. You're with the patient for longer. Also, if you can work in a hospital as a technician in an ER, you get entirely different skill sets than you do in the back of the box. All of those things are good. There's a variety of critical care courses and certifications that you can take to prepare yourself. So if you look at EMS Flight Crew, Flight Web, a few of the groups on Facebook, we discuss that stuff almost literally on a weekly basis. If you have any trouble finding anything, or if you have more specific questions, again, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll be delighted to help you out.
Thanks, Sean. So we have a couple more questions. They're actually pretty similar to that one, to be quite honest, but I'm going to go ahead and read them and see if we can parse out any of the differences. We have a question.
I'll reserve the right to say that. Okay, yep, same question, same answer. Go for it.
Well, so we have a three-part question here from Samuel Stratton, and the first part of it, he asked, are the volunteer requirements the same for professional employment, presuming for flight medicine or to participate in the medical missions?
So it really depends on where you're volunteering at and what the mission profile is. It is set by the organization. So yeah, I definitely couldn't answer that. It really is organization specific. If you have a specific organization in mind and you're not comfortable reaching out to them directly, again, contact me offline and I'll be happy to give you a pre-deployment briefing. Next part.
Okay, the next part is, how does one get involved initially?
Again, Sam, the thing there is seek it out. Build it and they will come. I knew when I got out of the military that I never wanted to stop flying and I never wanted to stop doing medicine. And generally, if you're hungry, people will feed you. I have been, I am standing on the shoulder of giants. If you demonstrate a willingness to learn and a humble attitude, the knowledge and the skills are going to find you.
Okay, and then the third part is, what are the potential initial starting/support roles?
Initial starting/support roles. You're gonna have to contact me offline about that one, Sam, because it's not, everyone has a pretty intensive skill set at a basic level, and then we build on that. So I'm not sure how to break your question down further, but hit me up offline and I'll be delighted to carry on the conversation with you. Okay, who have we got next? Andrew?
All right. Here's the last question. And this is from Miguel. And Miguel says, as a new aspiring paramedic to become a flight medic, I know certification is the primary step. What do you recommend as a way to prepare for it?
Sure. In terms of certifications, thank you for the question, Miguel. So basic certifications that you'll hear, as counterintuitive as it may sound, go ahead and study for and sit for your flight paramedic and critical care paramedic exams. And pretty easy to find information on how to do those. And make sure that when you do it, you maintain a humble attitude. Okay, because people are going to look at you askance without the experience to back up the letters behind your name. But at the same time, there's quite a few of us who will look at that as displaying initiative, because we know what it takes to successfully pass the flight paramedic exam or the critical care paramedic exam or the tactical paramedic exam, etc. So that's one route for you. There are a number of institutions that do offer critical care paramedic classes. There's pros and cons of all of those institutions and courses, and not something that I would want to go into verbally. But again, feel free, if you have a specific course or course of action that you're concerned about, feel free to reach out to me via email or Facebook. I would encourage you and give you the same advice that I gave Marie. EMS Flight Crew, Flight Web, and then various forums on Facebook would be great places to start. Again, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and we're all happy to mentor and provide advice. So if you're hungry, we'll feed you. Any other questions, Andrew?
No, that's it. So I really want to thank you, Sean, for, I know you're really extremely busy and you sort of found time for us while you're briefly visiting New York City to do this webinar. And I really want to thank you for taking the time. I know it's a lot of work. Putting a webinar together is like putting any presentation together and requires a fair amount of time. So I thank you for that. And I want to thank everyone in the remote audience for participating. We have another webinar coming up in about 2 weeks on terror medicine. So we'll be sending some information out about that as well if you'd like to participate in that. It'll actually be at the same time, but it'll be on a Wednesday rather than a Friday. And as I mentioned before, the recording and the slides from the presentation will be available online most likely later today, but definitely by tomorrow. And I will send that out by email, letting everyone know. So I just want to thank everyone. Thank you for supporting the webinar series. Thank Sean for presenting this webinar. And everyone have a great weekend, and we'll be in touch with you by email, letting you know of upcoming events and when that information is available online.
Yeah.